The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is in the O'Galley section of Melbourne, Florida. Preserved as it was in the early 20th century, historic tours of the Rossiter House include antiques, artifacts, and family heirlooms, and the 1865 Houston Family Cemetery. The last resident of the home was successful businesswoman and philanthropist Caroline P. Rossiter. The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is available for weddings and other special events.
Florida History and Culture from the Ice Age to the Space Age is on display at the Brevard Museum of History and Natural Science, located at 2201 Michigan Avenue in Cocoa. The museum has nature trails through 20 acres of 3 Florida ecosystems. The People of Windover exhibition features information about Florida's prehistoric past and actual artifacts used between 7,000 and 8,000 years ago. More information at brevardmuseum.org. The Department of State Division of Cultural Affairs, the Florida Council of Arts and Culture, and the state of Florida.
Rollins College, founded in 1885, is situated in beautiful Winter Park. Rollins is known for conference method teaching and an educational plan designed to develop character and maturity in the student. Classes are small and group discussions help make of education a cooperative adventure in learning.
A promotional video from the mid-20th century encourages students to attend Rollins College. Welcome to Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. I'm Ben Brotemarkle. In the late 19th century, Central Florida was still a sparsely populated, largely undeveloped wilderness. In 1885, the tradition of offering a progressive liberal arts education in Florida began here in Winter Park at Rollins College.
Winter Park raised almost $150,000, which in the late 19th century wasn't a small amount of money, and Alonzo Rollins gave $50,000 of that and the land here, and so they promised to name the college after Alonzo Rollins.
Many wealthy Northerners traveled to Florida in the 19th century, believing that the state's natural environment had restorative properties for people with health problems. Alonzo Rollins came to Winter Park hoping that the fresh air and sunshine would help to slow his cancer. Rollins College was originally founded by the Congregational Church.
The main purpose of people coming out of a liberal arts college were to be leaders of the country, leaders with character, which in the Victorian period meant placing the public life and public service over your own private interests. And a huge amount of effort went into creating that, not only in the classroom, but in the dormitories and the what they call college life.
Within 10 years of Rollins being established, the Big Freeze of 1894-95 devastated the economy of the area, significantly impacting the college.
In the first decade of the college, it depended almost entirely for its operating expenses on orange groves that had been donated to the college. So when the freeze came, not only did students leave, did families leave, taking their young people with them, but they lost the income.
Just as Rollins College was recovering financially from the Big Freeze, the United States entered World War I in 1917, taking almost all of the male students from the school.
The result was that by the time the war was over, the college was in serious difficulty. It was struggling just to open its doors every year.
Despite constant challenges and a separation from the Congregational Church, Rollins College was surviving well into the 20th century. In 1925, the Board of Trustees hired a transformative president named Hamilton Holt.
Well, Hamilton Holt was an international figure when he came to Rollins, but not as an educator. He was an international figure for his work as editor of The Independent, which was a liberal news and opinion magazine based in New York, and as a crusader for world government. And he counseled presidents, and he was very well known. And in fact, a lot of Rollins trustees felt like he was probably too famous to be interested in a little college in the middle of nowhere. But he was, and came here, and as you say, was a very transformative president.
Hamilton Holt made Rollins College an innovative center for learning that focused on student participation rather than a system of lecture and memorization.
So Holt came in with these ideas already in mind and introduced a new pedagogy where students would be in a classroom with a professor, and they would do most of the classwork, most of the research and writing right into class, while the professor simply served as a facilitator, moving from place to place. So he called it the 2-hour conference plan.
Holt's emphasis was on the student experience and on individualization in education. And he was a very unhappy undergraduate himself. He didn't like the lecture and recitation method. He didn't want Rollins to be like that. But he didn't think about adult education in the way we think about it today. He was focused entirely on undergraduates and making Rollins a great experience for undergraduates. Adult education was kind of secondary to him. And the way he viewed adult education was more like cultural tourism, because Winter Park was a resort destination, but it wasn't the beach. Wealthy people from the Northeast and the Midwest would come here to spend the winters, and they needed something to do. And the things they preferred to do were special interest classes, lectures, cultural events, that sort of thing. And Holt saw to it that there was plenty of that going on for these wealthy Northerners and Midwesterners to do when they were in Winter Park.
Holt began a process of encouraging any artist, any writer, any historian, any intellectual, any important figure to come to Rollins and come into residence, and he would treat them as faculty members. SINCLAIR Lewis was one of the first people he brought in, and that actually had a nice benefit when Lewis mentioned Rollins in his Nobel address, 1930. He brought in almost anyone you could imagine. He started what he called the animated magazine, which was a day in which writers, historians, sports figures would come to campus, and the program was organized like a magazine. He sat in a tall chair with an oversized pencil and eraser as the editor. He would have the front section with history and news. He would have a sports section. He would have a culture section, bring writers in for it. And that inspired departments to begin bringing artists onto campus. And of course, this was long before television. So students at Rollins had a chance to meet some of the seminal figures of the age. And that was an exciting time.
Holt, who was already a good publicist, publicized how experimental and innovative Rollins was becoming, and he was very successful in that. Rollins began to gain a national reputation as an innovative school.
Holt's tenure was not without controversy. In 1933, he fired a disruptive professor named John A. Rice.
Hamilton Holt liked to have controversial figures on campus, and he liked to have people who had unusual views, unusual points of view, people who weren't conventional, and he prided himself on that. But John Andrews Rice, who he hired as a professor of classical languages, was too much even for Holt. His classes were controversial because he talked about pretty much everything but classical languages. He talked about sex education, which was controversial. He didn't suffer fools gladly. Some students felt that he was insulting and condescending. He questioned the role of religion in the community, which angered the religious community. He was just an iconoclast and seemed to go out of his way to offend people, almost challenging Holt to do something about it. Well, you're this progressive guy who supposedly appreciates alternate points of view. What are you going to do about me? And what he did was he fired Rice.
Some Rollins faculty followed Rice to North Carolina, where they formed Black Mountain College, which operated until 1957.
Rice, as a leader, made all kinds of experiments. It was a community, and students were all involved in making every decision on campus and there. Plus, Rice managed to create a curriculum that put art at the center of it, and he managed to attract some really incredible people to that college over the years.
One of the most significant cultural figures to be associated with Rollins College is writer, folklorist, and anthropologist Zora Neale Hurston. Raised in Eatonville, an historic African-American community adjacent to Winter Park, Hurston studied anthropology under Franz Boas in New York.
She was actually one of the glories of the 1930s. When she came back to Florida, back to Eatonville, she wanted to find an intellectual community of writers. And she came to Winter Park, to a small bookstore, and the owner of the bookstore suggested that she get in touch with Edward Osgood Grover, who was officially the professor of books at Rollins. She and Grover became friends. He encouraged other faculty to spend time with her. She often came to campus. Hamilton Holt produced 2 of her shows in college properties. She read her stories here. She met with students.
In fact, Jonas Gordvine, her first novel, its publication was facilitated by faculty members here at Rollins. They contacted Lippincott on her behalf, and so it's not an exaggeration to say that her first published work was a result of the relationship and support of elements of the Rollins College campus.
She was so close to the faculty that one of them, Bob Wunsch, took her story that she had written, The Gilded Sixpence, and sent it to Story Magazine. They published it. J.B. Lippincott read it, wrote to her, asked her if she had a novel he could read, and she did what I think anyone would do, lied, said yes, sat down, and in 2 months wrote a novel. When it was published, she dedicated it to Bob Wunsch. In fact, of her 4 novels, 2 are dedicated to Rollins faculty members.
When our organization, the Association to Preserve the Eatonville Community, was contesting the 5-laning of East Kennedy Boulevard from Wymore Road to 1792, we actually had some of our organizing meetings on the campus of Rollins, because the community of Eatonville has also had a long-standing relationship with Rollins. There's an archive here that really documents that. But yes, indeed, as we prepared for the first annual Zora Neale Hurston Festival of the Arts and started having those planning meetings in 1988, we actually met a good deal of the time at Olin Library.
Peter Demens built the first railroad linking the interior of Central Florida to the Gulf Coast. The terminus was called St. Petersburg after his hometown in Russia. Demens also constructed the first buildings here at Rollins College in Winter Park. It was under Hamilton Holt, though, in the 1930s that Rollins acquired its distinctive Spanish Mediterranean style appearance.
Holt decided that he wanted to break with the old New England tradition, and one of the ways of doing that was to break with the architecture. So the first opportunity he had to construct a new building when he got the money for it, a dormitory, actually named Rollins Hall. He decided to choose a Florida style because he wanted to make Rollins a Florida school as well. And so he chose the Spanish Mediterranean architecture because that was the most popular in the 1920s when he built his first building.
The oldest structure on the Rollins College campus is a Queen Anne-style building called Pinehurst. Its architecture is symbolic of the Northeastern college ideals that the school was founded on. The dormitory directly next door is in the Spanish Mediterranean style, representing Holt's new vision for the college. Every college president since Holt has maintained this aesthetic with any new buildings constructed. The centerpiece of Rollins College is the Noles Memorial Chapel, where the Bach Festival Society of Winter Park has been in residence since 1935.
Well, they wanted to commemorate the 250th anniversary of Bach's birth. And so the day after his birthday, on March 22, 1935, they had a program of various Bach works. They thought it was such a good idea, they should repeat it again. And they did it the next year, and then the third year, and you know how the saying goes, you do it 3 times, it's a tradition. So it continued on for many, many years. And then the founder of it, Mrs. Sprague Smith, and the original conductor, Christopher Honas, Mrs. Sprague Smith died, and she was really the cheerleader. And the president at that time of the college, Hamilton Holt, called everyone together and said, are we going to continue this? We don't really have our cheerleader anymore, and maybe this was a nice run, but we should do something. Do any of you want to take this under your wing? Well, the story goes that Mr. John Tiki, who was there, said, well, you know, I'll take it for a year or two. And that meant 52 years as the president of the Bach Festival Society.
In 1949, the college hired a man named Paul Wagner, who was an executive at Bell and Howell. He was only 33 years old, to be the president of the college, to succeed Holt, who had retired. And Wagner promptly fired half the faculty and eliminated the football team and caused a furor on campus and in the community over these actions. And basically was fired by the trustees after 2 years and refused to recognize the legality of his firing, so wouldn't leave. So for a period of time, there were actually 2 parallel administrations on campus. One was Wagner in the president's office, and one was Hugh McCain, who was an art professor who had been appointed by the trustees to be the new president, who had his office at the Morse Museum of Art.
Hugh McCain graduated from Rollins College in 1930. He became an art instructor there in 1932 and was president of the college from 1952 until 1969. As founding director of the Charles Hosmer Morse Museum of American Art, McCain and his wife Jeanette assembled in Winter Park the most comprehensive collection of stained glass work by Louis Comfort Tiffany anywhere.
Hugh was an artist, and really in many ways I think first and foremost an artist, but he was a very clever Renaissance man. And he came here to Orlando, graduated Rollins, and was a fellow at Laurelton Hall with Louis Comfort Tiffany. He married Jeanette, became the first director of the museum when Mrs. McCain founded the museum, and then became president of Rollins College, and along with Mrs. McCain joined her in philanthropic activities throughout. But his special baby, as it were, outside of his career at Rollins, was the museum.
Perhaps the most famous graduate of Rollins College was Fred Rogers, creator and host of the groundbreaking television series Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood.
Oh, I adored Fred. He became a wonderful friend, and he spoke wonderfully of his years with the Bach Festival Choir. It influenced him musically. I know at his memorial service that we did for the college, he had told me that he wanted to be sure that I had some Bach in the program, and we ended with a piece from St. John Passion and did the famous air in the program. And so it was influential to him, but it was his participating with us is inspirational. His wife, Joanne, tells me that singing in a choir is her favorite activity because to put your small voice together with others makes it the most powerful force you can imagine. So we are really proud that Fred was a member of the Bach Festival Choir, and we at Rollins are proud that he's an alum, and I'm just grateful to have been his friend.
Fred was a wonderful man, quiet. His wife, Joanne, is a spark plug. She was great. He would come to social events, I think mostly because Joanne liked going to them. The only times at any of the parties that I attended with him that we had good conversations was when I was having a problem with my sons. And then he became very excited, fixed me in that laser-like look of his, and began asking questions. He rarely gave answers, but he would, in the perfect Socratic method, elicit your point of view by asking the questions. I actually got to know him best when I'd finished putting together a collection of essays by local teachers and Shakespeareans from around the world on a program that Stu Omens from UCF and I had run called Shakespeare in the Classroom. What I didn't realize then was that he had been operated on for cancer in January 6th, I think it was, and he died 2 weeks later. Joanne later told me that since he had promised me that he would do this, he wanted to do it. So I feel extraordinarily honored having the last thing he wrote as part of that book and part of his memory.
Rollins has continued to evolve while also remaining true to its liberal arts vision. The school's adult education program began as a form of cultural tourism and expanded into programs for soldiers and non-degree seeking community members. Today, the Hamilton Holt School offers a progressive college degree program that matches the day school.
In 1978, Thaddeus Seymour was hired as president of Rollins College. He had been president of a small liberal arts college in the Midwest and was very much a creature of the liberal arts. And one of the first things he did when he came to Rollins was to take a look at the evening program and say, this really doesn't fit with what we're doing in the day school. And yes, it makes a lot of money, but we have to bite the bullet and revise it so that it is more compatible with what we're doing in the day school and that it offers a liberal arts degree and liberal arts programs similar to what the day school offers and of equal quality.
I see that the college gradually, and at times purposefully, at times not, became transformed into an urban college. Still, the basis is a liberal arts education, but it has now responded to the growth of Central Florida. And in some ways, not the only one, but in some ways, that is the reason why Rollins has become stronger and stronger over the years.
All of us on the faculty are experts in something from the past. We were trained in the past. My field is 18th century. Jack Lane, my good friend's field, is early American history. The philosophers may be medieval philosophers, Platonic philosophers. And we have this body of knowledge, and flooding into campus are all these kids who are thinking only really about the future, who they will be and what they'll be. And our job is to connect them with that. So we have a tradition, we have that great tradition of innovation that Hamilton Holt began and Hugh McCain followed up on. Thad Seymour reinvented it. Rita Bornstein gave us the financial strength so that we could move forward with it. But at the same time, we need to change that. We need to adapt to a new world. We need to renovate. We can't live in the past because our students aren't going to live in the past, and they're not going to allow us to live in the past.
In recent decades, Rollins College has earned numerous accolades, including being ranked #1 among colleges and universities in the South by U.S. News and World Report. In the interest of full disclosure, I should mention that I'm a proud graduate of Rollins College. You've been watching Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. Visit us anytime on the web at myfloridahistory.org. Thanks for joining us. I'm Ben Brotemarkle. The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is in the O'Galley section of Melbourne, Florida. Preserved as it was in the early 20th century, historic tours of the Rossiter House include antiques, artifacts, and family heirlooms, and the 1865 Houston Family Cemetery. The last resident of the home was successful businesswoman and philanthropist Caroline P. Rossiter. The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is available for weddings and other special events.
Florida history and culture from the Ice Age to the Space Age is on display at the Brevard Museum of History and Natural Science, located at 2201 Michigan Avenue in Cocoa. The museum has nature trails through 20 acres of 3 Florida ecosystems. The People of Windover exhibition features information about Florida's prehistoric past and actual artifacts used between 7,000 and 8,000 years ago. More information at brevardmuseum.org. The Department of State Division of Cultural Affairs, the Florida Council of Arts and Culture, and the State of Florida.